Tonight, we begin a week's worth of special reports diving into the history of the correction system on tribal lands in North Dakota. Our crime and investigative reporter Renee Cooper has spent months unraveling the complex web of barriers that leaves cases unsolved and victims with nowhere to turn. These hurdles that tribal governments, the courts, and law enforcement have to jump over all trace back to a history of persecution against tribes. Tonight, we start where crime first meets the justice system, with police. Renee spoke with those who know firsthand how jurisdictional boundaries, a lack of resources, and outright discrimination muddles an officer's ability to serve and protect.
Meet Amber Johnson. She was a Bureau of Indian Affairs police officer for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe for 10 years.
There's times when I've been the only one working a 12-hour night shift,
which took a toll on her. And after a long career, Johnson retired her uniform.
This is all I've ever known, so it's kind of tough. I wouldn't know what to compare it to.
There are 3 separate jurisdictions that enforce 3 different sets of laws and statutes on tribal lands. State law enforcement, like your county sheriffs and highway patrol troopers. Then there are federal Bureau of Indian Affairs officers, like Johnson, and tribal police, who enforce laws and statutes specific to each tribal nation.
I think that's uniquely problematic on reservation communities.
Tim Purdon is a lawyer and the former U.S. Attorney for North Dakota from 2010 to 2015. He has a long history of representing North Dakota's tribes in court, and he says which law enforcement agency takes charge can be messy. It depends on if the offender is an enrolled tribal citizen, if the victim is or not, where the crime took place, and how serious it is.
When I was U.S. Attorney, there was a crime committed on the reservation. It was a quadruple homicide. 4 people were killed in a home invasion, and the 4 people who were killed were non-native. County sheriff, you've got state police, you've got the FBI, and they don't know who has jurisdiction to investigate the case because they don't know whether or not the shooter was native or non-native. Can you imagine being at the scene of a quadruple homicide and you don't know which cop, which detective has the authority to move forward with the investigation?
Purdon says it's common not to know who a suspect is, making this a regular issue. Here's the basic breakdown. In North Dakota, when the offender and the victim are native and the crime was committed on tribal land, for the most part, that's the tribe's jurisdiction, unless the crime falls under the Major Crimes Act, including offenses like murder and sexual assault. Then it's federal. If the offender is native but the victim is not on tribal lands, the same rules apply. However, if the offender is a non-native, it's almost always federal jurisdiction in native country. Unless the victim is also not an enrolled tribal member, then it's up to state police to handle. And finally, if a crime takes place on state land, no matter who the offender or victim are, it's the state's jurisdiction. What happens if Highway Patrol or any other agency pulls someone over, it's not their jurisdiction, then what?
I would say in the case of a crime that someone needs to go to jail, for example, we would try to find a way. We'd just wait until someone could respond. But in the case of like a traffic citation, maybe nothing's done, the individual's released.
The inability to cite, in many cases, comes down to a lack of officers. The same reason Johnson worked long shifts and communication breaks down between jurisdictions. That's where Trooper Jenna Clausen-Hubrights comes in. She's the cultural liaison officer for the North Dakota Highway Patrol. Her position was created to open up lines of communication with each tribal nation.
I always teach tribal jurisdiction in a really brief intro to everyone because I think it's important for new officers to understand that.
But it gets more murky because each tribal nation is its own sovereign nation with its own law enforcement agencies. For example, every tribe in North Dakota does have federal BIA police. But not all have tribal police, like Standing Rock, where federal officers like Johnson enforce both tribal and federal law. On the Fort Berthold Reservation, home of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, the tribe manages its own law enforcement through a contract with the federal government.
Because basically we feel we can do a better job than the federal government can. And in our case, most particularly, that's true because we were able to put more of our own tribal resources in.
Tripling the number of officers on the reservation. Chairman Fox says with the contract signed years back, Fort Berthold retained one BIA criminal investigator. Otherwise, the 3 affiliated tribes police department handles all but state law on its own land. In the Turtle Mountains, funding and resources are a little slimmer, according to Tribal Chairman Jamie Azure. As a result,
BIA still controls, I would say, 75%, and 25% is tribal.
the about 3 tribal officers are housed at a BIA facility, the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians Police Department, and they fall under the jurisdiction of a BIA police chief.
I wouldn't say they have ultimate authority, but they have more authority than I'm comfortable with.
Highway Patrol Superintendent Brandon Solberg says the confusion becomes a liability problem for law enforcement, and the goal is to move away from officers having to ask, are you an enrolled member or not, before helping someone in need. Progress has been made. At Standing Rock, BIA officers are cross-deputized with the Sioux County Sheriff's Department, so they can make stops and arrest non-natives on tribal land. But the Sioux County Sheriff in reverse couldn't act in that way over tribal members.
Correct.
MHA Nation has a form of cross-deputization that does work both ways through an agreement with the McLean County Sheriff's Office. But the Fort Berthold Reservation spans across 6 counties, so that agreement only goes so far.
We used to have cross-deputization with the cities of Newtown and the city of Parshall, their governments. And then all of a sudden, it was taken away. They wanted to have the non-tribal cop arrest a native perpetrator, but when a tribal cop or a BIA cop is arresting a non-tribal perpetrator, that wasn't very cool with them. And so after about 7-8 years of those just fell to the wayside.
Officer Johnson sums it up best.
Our boots on the ground guys, the guys working our agency, definitely do the best that they can, and until it's out of their hands, they make sure that as much that they can do that they take care of.
Reporting for KX News from North Dakota's tribal nations, Renee Cooper.
Trooper Clausen Hubrights is hoping one day there can be agreements between the tribes, all of the counties they're in, and the Highway Patrol, so no matter where you are, someone can respond. Chairman Fox agrees, adding, statewide cross-deputization was brought to the state legislature twice and failed. He hopes the partnership with McLean County will set an example that encourages other counties to make similar agreements with tribal nations. Trooper Clausen Hubright's position at the Highway Patrol was a long time coming. She says the agency realized they need to build more trust and relationships. And in 2017, the cultural liaison was created in part as a response to the Dakota Access Pipeline protest in 2016. Chase Iron Eyes is a lawyer and activist who grew up on Standing Rock. He was arrested by state agencies on private property just outside of his homeland during the protests.
I was traumatized by the state of North Dakota because of their threats to try to imprison me based on my free speech.
Right or wrong, that wasn't Iron Eye's first run-in with state law enforcement. He says these stories trace back to when he was a kid visiting the capital city. He says when you think back, it's not all that long ago that the land of the Dakotas was stolen from the First Nation. And even after treaties were made and the right to vote was established for tribal members, he says his native family has always had and still has a different experience with law enforcement than their white neighbors.
Me and my friends found ourselves without a ride up there. So we had nowhere to go. So we essentially walked down the middle of the street until a police officer confronted us, and we told him that, hey, we have no way to call our parent. This was before cell phones. And I remember he called us animals. He referred to us as animals, like he's on the radio talking and saying that I had to pick up some animals off the road. It comes from this tradition of dehumanizing and otherizing and villainizing.
The discrimination shows in our federal prisons. Standing Rock's in-house lawyer says although somewhere around 0.9% of the U.S. population is Native, they are represented twice as often in federal prisons.